Please welcome the Center on Rural Innovation's Mark Rembert.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here from the Center on Rural Innovation to talk to you, I think, about one of the most interesting and exciting trends shaping the U.S. economy today and shaping rural communities, which is remote work. So just a little bit of background on the Center on Rural Innovation. We are a national nonprofit organization that is committed to the belief that small towns are home to big ideas. And we believe that the future of the tech economy should be rooted in rural America. We support a network and work with a network of over 30 rural communities across the country that are advancing tech-based economic development with partner organizations on the ground, including SOAR here in Eastern Kentucky. And I'm the director of research at Corey, and part of our research agenda is really to bring attention to the growth of the tech economy in rural America and identify policies and strategies that community leaders in rural communities can adopt to help build tech economies. And a big part of that, I think one of the most common questions we get is about remote work and how rural communities can leverage remote work. And as you all know, we're in the midst of this massive remote work experiment. Prior to the pandemic, 5, maybe 6% of people nationally worked remotely. But in May of 2020, at the sort of peak of the pandemic shutdowns, 35% of the American workforce started working from home because of the pandemic. Millions and millions of people who had never worked from home were working from home for the first time. In fact, in 2021, 26 million Americans reported that they were working from home, including 1.6 million people living in rural America. And so people now in the United States have more flexibility in where to live than they've ever had before because of remote work. Now you can see in this graph that the rates of remote work have been trending downward as people have been going back into the office. But things have changed fundamentally, and I think we can expect that remote work is here to stay and will probably continue to grow going forward. And there are a few reasons why. One is that millions of people have experienced remote work for the first time. Many of them have discovered they really like remote work and have said going forward that they would prefer to work remotely for the rest of their careers. Additionally, there's been a massive investment in technology to support remote work. Just after the pandemic, the number of patents for technologies related to remote work more than doubled. I imagine that in 10 years, when we look back at how we work remotely today, we will probably laugh at the technology that we're currently using. And this presents really fantastic opportunities for rural communities for a couple of reasons. One is that it expands the career opportunities that are available to people living in rural communities. Second, it provides an opportunity to diversify rural economies. And third, it creates new opportunities for rural communities to leverage their amazing community assets to attract new residents. One of the things that we've really learned through the pandemic is that some occupations and jobs are really well suited for remote work and others aren't. These probably aren't a surprise to you. Jobs in tech, in management, in sales, in business and financial operations are really good remote jobs. Whereas some jobs like food production or manufacturing jobs just can't be done remotely and have to be done in person. And this the fact that there is a strong relationship between certain jobs and remote work means that from a regional or community perspective, the mix of jobs that people in your community do will really determine the extent to which remote work will have an impact in your community. So if we look back over the last several years between 2019 and 2021, the communities who had a mix of occupations in their community that were very suited for remote work saw the largest increase in actual remote work during the pandemic. And this helps us give a sense of what is the potential in rural communities today for people who are already in jobs that are suitable for remote work or have high remote work potential. And if we look at Eastern Kentucky, about a third of people today work in jobs with a high remote work potential, which is just in line with the rest of rural America, although a little bit behind the rest of the country. And because occupational mix is so critical for shaping remote work potential, we can see that some communities in the region are going to be in different starting places in thinking about how to leverage remote work in your communities today based on the mix of people and the jobs that they're doing and how closely those jobs align with remote work. But that doesn't mean that every community doesn't have something that it can do to leverage this movement, this remote work revolution. So when we think about what it takes for a community to be remote work ready, there are sort of three things that we've seen in practices as we've worked with communities all across the country. So first is understanding who your remote workers are. And I'll talk a little bit about different remote worker types. Different types have different needs and create different opportunities for the community. Second is putting in place supports that are particularly tailored to the needs of remote workers. And then third is developing supportive ecosystems that allow remote workers to tap into those supports and resources. And so when we think about, for your community, thinking about a remote work strategy, I'd encourage you to think about three types of remote workers and think about their specific needs. So first are hybrid remote workers. These are people who may work part-time in an office and part-time from home. And going forward, there are probably going to be many, many people in this sort of hybrid remote work environment. Second are what we call local remote workers. These are people from your communities who are transitioning from a job that was primarily local and in person to a job that is fully remote. And then third are what we call new locals. And these are people who have a remote job today but live elsewhere and bring that job to your community. So in thinking about how to leverage remote work in your regions or in your communities, it's important to think about remote work not as just a piece, but part of a broad economic development framework. And so at the most critical sort of piece of infrastructure they need for remote work is broadband. And I know there's tons of content at the conference this week on broadband, so I'm not going to go into that. I think everybody here agrees that broadband is critical. The second element to really think about are supports for remote workers. And there are some very specific things that remote workers need that might be different than other workers in your community. First is training in skills that align with remote work jobs. And as I mentioned, certain jobs are very conducive to remote work, others aren't. And it's really important to understand the occupational mix in your community today, and also be aware of what are the jobs that are perhaps outside of your community, and how do you build training and workforce development to help people develop the skills that are aligned with those jobs, not necessarily the jobs that are just immediately in your community today. Second are professional development for remote workers. Remote workers, one of the biggest challenges that remote workers report facing is loneliness and lack of connection to colleagues. And so making sure that there are opportunities for remote workers to connect and network and build themselves professionally while working from home. And then third are co-working spaces, which we see as critical assets in rural communities today because they provide that physical space where coworkers can go to get broadband, to get professional development, and to network and find community. And then the third element of a remote work strategy really has to focus on quality of life. Because in a sense, we think about economic development often as competing for investment from companies. And so we think about how do we leverage the assets of our community in a way that best aligns with the interest of companies. But when we're thinking about remote work, we have to think about how do we leverage the assets of our community to align with the interests of families, of workers, of people. So things like housing, quality of life, education, childcare, affordable housing, all of those elements of quality of life are absolutely critical to building a successful remote work strategy in your community. So I want to wrap up by talking about one fantastic example of a rural community that's really putting this framework into practice, and that's Marquette, Michigan. They're in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, very, very remote. And they saw an opportunity to really leverage the fact that they have incredible natural resources to be a destination for remote workers. And so it started out as a partnership between three key entities in the community their sort of innovation hub, which supports entrepreneurs and investors, their local university, Northern Michigan University, and the Tourism Bureau. And they got together and came up with an incredible marketing campaign that really featured the assets of the community in a new way, primarily focused on remote workers. They then leveraged their university's alumni network to get that marketing campaign out, not just targeting anybody in the world and saying, come to our community, but really honing in on the people who had an established connection with their community, people who went to the university, who might have a desire to come back and make a home in a community that they didn't think they could have before remote work. And then finally, they made some key investments in infrastructure and in training. So they renovated a historic building in their downtown and turned it into a co-working space. And they launched a really innovative cybersecurity program to provide workforce development opportunities for people in their community aligned specifically with jobs that have a high potential for remote work. So when we think about what your community can do to get started, a few suggestions. And the first is to find the people who are already working remotely in your community, to have a conversation with them, to learn what's working for them, to learn what their challenges are. There are likely people who are already in this position, so start with them and learn from what they can share. Then it's really critical to understand the occupation mix in your community, to understand what are the jobs that are already in place that have remote work potential. And those are opportunities to help people in your community who might have interest in remote work but may not know how to pursue those career options. Third, really look at your workforce development infrastructure and ask, are we aligning our training opportunities with the occupations and jobs that have the most remote work potential? And then finally, convene cross-sector players. This has to really be a systems effort. It's not a single activity. You need a lot of players at the table: workforce, economic development, higher ed, community planning. Anybody who's involved with developing the quality of life assets of your community need to be at the table to think about how can your community best leverage remote work. So with that, if you'd like to learn more about our research, you can find us at ruralinnovation.us/resources. And I look forward to talking to you at the reception. Thanks.